The UK is set to announce its new Prime Minister, and with both candidates touting their anti-authoritarian credentials, could this herald a new golden era for Taiwan? Joining me in the studio to discuss this are William Dong, an associate researcher at the Institute for National Defence and Security Research, an expert on US-China-Taiwan relations and European security, and also Ben Blanchard, Reuters Taiwan Bureau Chief. Later, we're joined by Richard Stokes-Green, CEO of the British Chamber of Commerce in Taipei. And we also speak to Taiwan's Vice Minister of Overseas Community Affairs Council, Roy Le, and Central News Agency London correspondent Yulia Chen. But first, our TaiwanPlus reporter Ken Ning takes a look at the two prime ministerial candidates and how they might impact the Taiwan Strait.
The UK will soon have a new Prime Minister. It's a choice between former Chancellor Rishi Sunak and the current Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, the frontrunner to replace Boris Johnson.
Well, I do not support China's inflammatory language on this issue. It's perfectly reasonable what is taking place, and I urge China to de-escalate.
That was Truss on China's aggressions following the US House Speaker's visit to Taiwan. The Foreign Secretary has taken a strong stance against Russia's invasion of Ukraine and drawn links with China, calling on a network of liberty to counter both states.
We have to take a tougher stance. We have to learn from the mistakes we made of Europe becoming dependent on Russian oil and gas. We cannot allow that to happen with China, and freedom is a price worth paying.
Yet, with Europe set to pay through the roof for energy, analysts wonder whether her anti-China stance can last if she makes it into office. Months before the leadership race, Truss seemed to indicate the UK should sell arms to Taiwan.
We need to preempt threats in the Indo-Pacific, working with our allies like Japan and Australia to ensure the Pacific is protected. And we must ensure that democracies like Taiwan are able to defend themselves.
But in a Sky News leadership debate on August 4th, she dodged a question on whether the UK should arm Taiwan. She told the debate, "What we do need to make sure is that democracies like Taiwan are defended, and we do license exports to Taiwan up at the moment, exports that are provided by the private sector." Truss was drawing the PRC's anger much earlier. In 2021, she pledged solidarity with Lithuania under Chinese fire for allowing Taiwan to open a representative office using the name Taiwanese rather than a commonly used Taipei. In contrast, her rival Sunak has taken aim at China only during the leadership race. Perhaps that's understandable given traditional Treasury orthodoxy. Nevertheless, he's labeled China the UK's biggest long-term threat and released a 5-point plan to tackle its influence. The former Chancellor has adopted language that echoes Truss's own. He said of Beijing, abroad they are propping off Putin's fascist invasion of Ukraine by buying his oil and attempting to bully their neighbors, including Taiwan. On August 23rd, Sunak rolled out any change on the UK's Taiwan policy. When asked what he would do if China attacked Taiwan, he said, "The best thing we can do to prevent aggression against Taiwan from China is showing Russia that they will not be successful in Ukraine."
That report by Ken Ning. Ben, as we've just seen, China has been an issue in the leadership race. How important is this China issue for the political establishment, and how does it compare to the issue for the general public?
So the China issue has actually been a very major part of the campaign stumps for both candidates. Both have talked about it. Obviously, Liz Truss has talked about it a lot more. She is currently the Foreign Secretary. So it has, while obviously there are many other issues that are dominating the race in Britain, like the cost of living crisis, China has, as a major policy issue, really sort of become very front and centre in the hustings that we've seen between the two candidates.
William Dong, Taiwan has also been mentioned. Where does Taiwan sit in all this?
Taiwan is always, China says, the most sensitive issue and the most concerned issue for the China. So then we can say Taiwan is the softest part of China. Whenever you want to make an issue or want to make your voice to China, talk about Taiwan.
The Times of London, Ben, has reported that Liz Truss is planning to name China as a national security threat for the first time as part of a review of the integrated defence, security, foreign policy. Practically, how would that play out?
So it's a bit difficult to know exactly how that's going to play out at the moment. Obviously, the election campaign hasn't finished. The leadership campaign hasn't issued yet. I mean, certainly this is the kind of thing that if she does become the next prime minister, inevitably this is going to upset China.
William, so in this integrated review sets out the UK's foreign policy, defence, security, Russia is named as an acute threat. So it's believed that Liz Truss would want to elevate China to a similar sort of level of threat. What do you think might be the changes that we could see coming out of the UK if that occurs?
I think that this, his assessment about the China's status in British national security. I think when Liz put the Taiwan and put the China the same as the Russia as a threat, of course I think that will have a huge impact for Taiwan, as I mentioned.
Ben, could we look at basically the two candidates, their policies or their positions? We don't have the policy yet. Or their positions on China. How would you characterize, on the one hand, Liz Truss's, and on the other side, Rishi Sunak's?
So what I would say about Liz Truss, she's obviously the Foreign Secretary at the moment, so she does have she has a background, right? She has an understanding of international diplomacy. So Liz Truss has been talking about Taiwan during the election campaign, during the hustings and the election campaign. She obviously has been talking about Taiwan as well in her role as Foreign Secretary when we had the Chinese war games very close to Taiwan. So she has been very hawkish. She has been sounding very strong in criticism of China. But she's also said that, broadly, like policy from Britain on Taiwan is not going to change in the sense that we're not suddenly going to have some, severing of the diplomatic relationship with Beijing and establishing ties with Taiwan.
William, so would you agree that Liz Truss is a China hawk? Her critics say that much of what has come out is chasing headlines.
This is always a relative issue. If you compare with Sunak, and don't forget that if these two candidates, I think Sunak already, the Chinese, if I remember it right, the Chinese foreign speakers already said, he said Sunak is a practical politician. He's the only candidate get the Chinese government officially speak a good word on it.
And yet he came out with a 5-point plan to tackle China's influence in the UK.
Yes, and I think that's what I say. Yes, just like the Liz Truss already have. So I think it's a relative issue. Even he tried to play tough to the China, but I think the China. I think if you compare with these two candidates, I think China maybe will, more favor about Sunak.
And one thing that nobody in the Conservative Party or in the British government talks about anymore is what was the so-called golden era relationship between between China and Britain, which was very much championed under the previous premiership of David Cameron. I mean, it's just not discussed anymore. Doesn't exist.
Presidential candidates or prime ministerial candidates, during the campaign, they will talk tough on China, but when they get into office, economic realities take over. Do you think that this could happen to either of these?
I'll answer that by saying fundamentally in Western countries, and this is absolutely the case in Britain, there's a big rethink going on at the moment about how do you deal with China. So that has come from issues like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, suspicion in Western countries that China somehow covered up the origins of COVID-19, and of course now the war in Ukraine, where China, while maybe not overtly supporting Russia, certainly hasn't condemned what Russia is doing. China and Russia remain extremely close friends. So there is a big rethink going on at the moment that maybe 10 years ago, where the focus on the China-Europe relationship or the Britain-Europe relationship was very much focused on trade. Now this has all changed. There are these huge fundamental changes going on in the geopolitical, geopolitically globally. So where these debates that are happening in Western democracies are absolutely happening in Britain now.
Truss's Mansion House speech in April, she spoke about, which we saw in the report, she spoke about ensuring Taiwan has the means to defend itself. And this has echoes of the US commitment to Taiwan in the Taiwan's Relations Act, the TRA. But later on, when she was directly asked, should the UK sell arms to Taiwan, she was more ambiguous. How do you read her position on that?
I think it's all about how Britain wants to play a role in the Indo-Pacific. I think now British government try to make a more balanced strategic perspective from Europe and between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And when you turn your eyes on Indo-Pacific, and of course the Taiwan Strait issue is quite, come up. It'd be a very important one. And then we can see that in last years, in the the G7 is the first topic to mention about concern about Taiwan. The peace and stability is important for the G7 country, and don't forget that. I think in this August, when China make a military exercise, G7 speak out their concern. It's never happened before.
So, I mean, Britain actually has licensed equipment for use in Taiwan's new indigenous submarine program. So there is actually British involvement in helping Taiwan improve its defenses. Now, of course, what we don't see is in the same way that the Americans will sell Taiwan F-16 fighters, anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles, things like that. We don't see that from Britain. But absolutely, there is a British role that is going on and continues to go on in helping Taiwan improve its defenses. But this is always a very fine line for any European government to draw, because if to walk, because of course if you overtly sell weapons to Taiwan, then of course you invite a massive blowback from Beijing.
Taiwan agreed its national budget, and there was a jump in the defense spending, double digits, to $19 billion US. Does this present a lucrative market for the UK's defense industry?
So what President Tsai Ing-wen has been doing, of course, is trying to develop Taiwan's own indigenous defense program as well. So Taiwan has realized over the years that ultimately it has to rely on itself for its defense. So Taiwan has a very impressive missile program, for example. They've been testing very advanced missiles that can potentially reach very far into China. Of course, Taiwan builds its own fighter jets, or previously it did, the indigenous defense fighter. Now has a new trainer, which is based on the indigenous defense fighter. But of course, when it comes to Taiwan's overseas arms sales, of course, these all come from, or basically all come from the United States. Because as you say, it's in US law that the Americans have to help Taiwan provide the means to defend itself. In Britain, there is no equivalent of the Taiwan Relations Act.
What would it take, William, for that perhaps to happen, to move towards something like that? 12 months ago, we didn't think that Germany would ever send arms to another country, but they have now.
I think China make it clear, everyone knows, unlimited, the companionship with Russia. And that's, of course, make Europe quite concerned, especially now Russia was be concerned as the NATO's the most important, the threat. Then, if China is kind of the unlimited, the companionship or partnership with Russia, of course, that's what make NATO or the European country is concerned about China. And then the large, as I say, when you concern China, then you have to consider now what the China most concerned part, Taiwan. Then they will concern the Taiwan as well.
It seems that the lessons from Ukraine are that maybe more could have been done to actually prevent the invasion in the first place. And these have been sort of hinted by some things that Liz Truss has said. Both of the candidates, Ben, have mentioned the Orcas Trilateral Security Partnership. This is, of course, the security partnership between Australia, the UK and the US. What does this security agreement represent for the UK?
Right, so I'll answer this indirectly by saying that, like for all countries, including the United States, or the countries that Taiwan considers it's friendly to, so that's Japan, Australia, Britain, in Europe as well, France and some others, there's always been this policy of strategic ambiguity, right? So nobody actually knows, there's no clear policy statement as to what would happen were China to directly attack Taiwan. So if push comes to shove, if there is a war, how does AUKUS how does AUKUS respond to this? How does NATO respond to it? How do the Americans, how do the Japanese respond to it? Of course, Japan is very close. We have a major US Air Force base in Okinawa, which it's like an hour's flight from Taipei. We don't know. It's a policy conundrum. It has been for a long time.
William, do you think AUKUS could draw the UK into a conflict in the Taiwan Strait?
I think it's still hard to tell, because if we look back in the Ukrainian war, even the Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, there's such a strong support in Ukraine, but they don't want to really,
Let me speak about specifics, because what we know about AUKUS is the nuclear-powered submarines.
Yes.
Yeah. So my understanding is a nuclear-powered submarine could get from Australia to Taiwan, whereas previously, without the nuclear-powered, it cannot.
I think if really when the time comes, American really get involved, then I think Japan get involved, then all his Americans, many the military ally like the UK and Austria is very likely to get involved. Of course, that's to what degree or to what extent they get involved. It's still, I think one thing when we look what happened in Ukraine, because now international society will make it example what happened in Ukraine or what happened will be in Taiwan. And what happened in Ukraine is American or the Western country, they don't want really get a confrontation with Russia. I think maybe that was the same case what happened in the Taiwan Strait.
2015 to 2017 was the so-called golden era of UK PRC ties under David Cameron's premiership and also Chancellor George Osborne. They pledged to be China's partner in the West. Now, how did we get from there to where we are now? There's been a series of events that have shifted British attitudes. Let's take a look.
In January 1950, the UK was the first Western power to break ties with the ROC or Taiwan, instead recognizing the PRC. More than a decade after its embassy was shut down, the ROC opened its representative office in the UK in September 1962. It wasn't until March 1972 that the UK PRC upgraded their relationship to ambassadorial level, marking full diplomatic ties. In June 1997, Hong Kong was returned from British to Chinese sovereignty after a termination of a Qing-era 99-year lease. In the 1980s, a one-country, two-systems agreement was arranged between the UK and PRC, allowing the territory a high degree of autonomy. In September 2014, Hong Kong's pro-democracy umbrella movement broke out protesting the PRC's decision to roll out full universal suffrage in the territory. In September 2015, Chancellor George Osborne delivered a speech in China speaking of a golden era for the UK-China relationship, thought to be the first time the phrase was used. In June 2020, China introduced a national security law for Hong Kong without any direct participation by its people. It targeted the vaguely defined terms of secession, subversion, and terrorism. In July 2020, the UK announced Huawei equipment would be removed from UK 5G networks by 2027. In June 2021, the first Uyghur Tribunal hearing took place in the UK. It alleged the PRC had committed crimes against humanity, including genocide in Xinjiang. In September 2021, Britain sent its first warship through the Taiwan Strait since 2008, though a British survey ship also transited in 2019. In July 2022, British and American intelligence agencies MI5 and the FBI also declared the PRC's poses the biggest long-term threat to economic and national security. British spy agency MI6 also said China was its top priority. In August 2022, in the wake of U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, the UK announced its own postponed parliamentary visit would go ahead this year.
Ben, if I can come to you. So in your view, which were the most significant triggers for the shift in attitudes against China?
So there have been plenty of triggers here that have happened. I mean, most obviously, of course, has been the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong. This is a very sort of evocative issue for Britain, of course, because Hong Kong was previously a British colony, and under the terms of the handover agreement, Britain is supposed to continue to have this sort of role to oversee, to sort of make sure that the agreement is still being followed through in terms of, giving it a sort of a high degree of autonomy and its freedoms.
The one country, two systems.
One country, two systems, exactly. Now, of course, like Britain was very concerned, along with other Western countries, but of course for Britain it's much more sort of an emotional issue here as well, because it was a former colony. So you saw that happen. Then, of course, Xinjiang, in China's Xinjiang, China putting Uyghurs into, very heavily criticized by Western governments. Of course, China defended it, putting Uyghurs into these vocational training centres. This is something that was reported widely on in Britain. It's something the British government expressed a lot of concern about. But Hong Kong very much is this sort of, it is very sort of close to the hearts of the British government because of that historic relationship.
So this feeling of responsibility.
So traditionally, of course, but then of course China just turns around and says, "Oh, it's just a historical document. It has no meaning." So sort of, and then Britain, of course, accused China, this is an international treaty, you can't break it like that. So China views Hong Kong in the same way that it views Taiwan, right? It's like it's an internal affair. No foreign country has a right to interfere. And China says, this is what we're doing, this is absolutely our right, butt out.
William, how about for you? Which were the most significant triggers?
Yeah, I think Hong Kong, of course, is a wake-up call to let the UK to see what the communist China, what really is. And of course, when it's have to look, especially when Xi Jinping come to power, it's competed to, to emphasize about the Chinese nationalism, and Chinese already, stand up something like that, and that's of course make the Western countries is more concerned. They want to challenge the Western societies, the international order. I think that's what make the UK, get involved in these issues.
Okay, thank you. The UK's Foreign Affairs Committee has announced that its long-awaited trip will go ahead by the end of the year. I spoke to CNA's London correspondent, Yulia Chen, earlier to discuss this more.
Alicia Kearns told me in an exclusive interview for CNA, it's the duty of the parliamentarians to know more about situations in the region.
Does the announcement by Tom Tugendhat in the wake of Nancy Pelosi's trip, does that give the trip even more significance?
The trip itself is significant in the new geopolitical context. Tom Tugendhat mentioned that when he took over chair of the committee, he was planning a trip to China, and the Chinese side demanded that some of the committee members who are also members Taiwanese, a friendship group with Taiwan, they should apologize first in order to get visa to China. So Beijing pushed, but the committee didn't back down. They didn't back down, and they've learned from this experience that you have to know what you are fighting for, and you have to stick to your principles. As a coordinator of the committee, Alicia Kearns told us in the interview, the only reason that the committee would consider canceling the trip is that if the Taiwanese side told them not to visit Taiwan at a certain time. This trip itself is an important symbol of friendship or support from the British side.
What did she have to say about how UK and Taiwan can expand ties?
The Foreign Affairs Committee would like to explore how the UK and Taiwan could cooperate more productively, more effectively in different aspects. For example, technology, supply chain resilience, and they would like to learn Taiwan's experience in tackling hybrid warfare waged by China, because the British society is also now having this kind of experience. Alicia personally would like to explore the possibility of striking an UK-Taiwan free trade agreement. She's been talking a lot about the Mandarin learning in the UK, because in the UK, in order to learn Mandarin, Confucius Institutes are practically almost the only option that's present here. So she's been pushing more cooperation with Taiwan in this aspect.
With the Confucius Institutes, what sort of harm do critics of the institutes say they are doing?
Freedom of expression is quite restricted in this sort of institutes that are eventually under the control of the government of China. So there may be problems with the history they're teaching and the ideology they are promoting through language teaching. And that has raised quite a big concern in the British society.
So would an example of that be maybe erasing the Tiananmen Square massacre?
So the students
Taiwan.
may not be allowed or encouraged to discuss, for example, Tiananmen Square events or Taiwan or Tibet, or the discussion will be guided in a certain way that is correct for the CCP.
Yulia, why do you think it is that the UK has the largest number of institutes of any country?
The British society, it's an open and free society, but sometimes maybe they may have kind of naive approach to different things. Confucius Institutes, they are very strong in promoting their services in a systematic way. They have big resources. So I think it's only natural for any government or university or school to cooperate with a partner who can very effectively offer you something, and you don't have to think a lot because everything is ready there.
That's quite interesting. Do you think that Rishi Sunak's campaign pledge to close down all 30 institutes, do you think that's a signal that Britain is losing that naivety?
But in some way, it's another kind of naivety, because, okay, you close all the Confucius Institutes. What can you offer? What can the universities and the schools offer instead to its students? It's a bit disappointing, to tell the truth, that Rishi Sunak suddenly started to talk tough on China, and it's only lasted, I think, 1 or 2 days.
Finally, what's the understanding amongst the British public about Taiwan? Is there much support there?
British society in general is very supportive of all the important principles without which Taiwan just can't survive. Rules-based international order, freedom, rule of law, and democracy. So the British society is very supportive, in general takes a quite strong stance towards upholding these principles. So from this perspective, they may be very supportive of Taiwan, but to which degree, that's the question.
The British public's support of Ukraine, how far does that go? I mean, now Britain, as other parts of Europe, are being plunged into this energy crisis heading into winter. So how much support is there for Ukraine? And is it interesting to compare, as you said, how far does the support go for Taiwan?
So the British government has never made clear whether a military intervention is possible or should be considered at all when there should be any conflict in Taiwan Strait. But that's a question that I think the parliamentarians will be posing to the government time and again. The general public in Britain, they of course doesn't know in details all the complicated interactions, the history of Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine and so on. But the overall feeling is these important principles, for example, rules-based international order, that the border of any country cannot be changed by force. All these very important principles are held dear.
This concept of, a sovereign nation being invaded. Does Britain consider Taiwan to be a nation?
They try to avoid some of the more difficult moments concerning the status of Taiwan. And I think it's understandable. And whether to lend support to Taiwan in its moment of need, it still depends a lot, I think, on the geopolitical situation in the region.
That was Yulia Chen speaking to me from London. Now our political editor, Rath Wang, speaks to Vice Minister of the Overseas Compatriot and Affairs Council, Roy Lee.
Vice Minister, British MP Alicia Kearns mentioned that the only way for university students to learn Chinese is through the PRC's Confucius Institutes. How many Taiwan centers for Mandarin learning are there planned for in the UK?
It's a very interesting question. With Mandarin learning fever spreading around the world, the OCAC, Overseas Community Affairs Council, has assisted overseas compatriot schools and associations to set up Taiwan centers for Mandarin learnings worldwide. Up to date, there are 2 centers in UK, Huaxia Chinese School in Camden and Chinese Learning Paradise in Kent. There are also 2 in France and 1 each in Germany, Ireland, Sweden, Austria, Hungary, and 34 more in the United States. So far, we have received very good feedback from local mainstream society. We look forward to seeing 100 TCMLs coming up in the year 2025.
Kearns believes that the centers are a way for people to learn about Taiwan through language, history, and culture. Aside from language, what do these centers teach in the UK?
Students of TCMLs will have the opportunity not only to learn Mandarin with traditional characteristics, but also to learn the language through beautiful, diverse cultural, arts, and heritage. Furthermore, TCMLs introduce technologies of the smart education industry into Mandarin teaching to improve study efficiency and enhance learning interest.
Vice Minister, what is your vision for the centers and how does it differ from that of the Confucius Institutes?
I noticed, as many people may have known, the Confucius Institutes were taken as global propaganda apparatus of CCP, and they were designated as a foreign mission by the State Department of United States for involving espionage. Conversely, TCMLs uphold the universal values of freedom, democracy, and respect of human rights. Students will learn Mandarin with traditional characteristics, be invited to join activities with local communities to learn Taiwanese culture, arts, and heritage, and they shall have an opportunity to visit Taiwan to personally experience what they have learned.
What is the plan for the Taiwan Center's global footprint? And in what way do these language centers enhance Taiwan's soft power?
We hope that TCMLs will appeal to more people to take Mandarin courses and therefore learn more about Taiwan and Taiwanese culture, including traditional characters, arts, and heritages. Through the TCMLs, Taiwan showcases the world that we share the same core value, such as freedom and democracy, diversity and inclusion, developing technologies, and accelerating toward SDGs, and focus on gender equality. We hope that the voice of Taiwan can be heard by the world, and the force of good of Taiwan can be seen by the world. Taiwan will continue to be an indispensable member of the international community.
That was our political editor, Rath Wang, speaking to Vice Minister for Overseas Compatriot Affairs Council, Roy Lee. And now let's talk about, before we get into the Mandarin learning centres, let's talk about the trip by the UK Foreign Affairs Committee, William. There have been many trips around Nancy Pelosi, the US House Speaker's trip to Taiwan, and there's more planned from Canada and Germany. Can we say that the result of China's aggressions around Nancy Pelosi's trips have actually strengthened solidarity with Taiwan?
I think, as you already mentioned, it seems that Taiwan is a place. If you want to show you don't agree with the Chinese, the value, and then will come to Taiwan to show his support. And I think that's the issue. Especially China uses this kind of very aggressive way to to try to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait.
So China says that these trips are a provocation because they lend sovereignty to Taiwan, which is an independent nation but is claimed by China. Can we talk about the UK's position on this in contrast to the US's position, and what's the likelihood of that UK position changing ever so slightly if Liz Truss becomes PM?
So Britain, of course, like all European countries, apart from the Vatican City, has no formal diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. Of course, there is a de facto British embassy here, which is called the British Office, which also is something that China doesn't like. The British government was one of the very earliest governments in, I think, 1950 to sever relationships, to establish relationships with a formal diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China, swapped ambassadors in 1972. So they had that very long history of diplomatic ties. Now, the Taiwan-Britain relationship, of course, Taiwan in the 1970s, even up into the 1980s, it was still a dictatorship, right? So it was starting, President Jiang Jingguo was starting the process of democratization, and then, of course, we had Li Denghui elected.
And Ben, the reason why I'm asking you this is because Liz Truss had made some comments talking about how it was the right of the Taiwanese people to decide their future.
So, what Britain is okay. So Britain has a one China policy, right? So again, it does not recognize officially the government in Taiwan. So this meant, for example, when President Tsai was re-elected 2 years ago, the then Foreign Secretary in Britain tweeted congratulations to Dr. Tsai Ing-wen for the election, right? Because you can't officially call President Tsai the president. Now, of course, what Britain does want, which is very similar to what the Americans want, of course, or the same, so wants to maintain stability in the Taiwan Strait, right? The differences are resolved peacefully between the two. So it's not in Britain's interest or any country's interest, really, for there to be war between Taiwan and China.
Does UK think that Taiwan believe that Taiwan is a part of China?
So I'll answer that by saying, officially, the British government's policy on this is that it does not have it does not recognize Taiwan as a state, right? But that really is no different from 90% of the countries in the world. Only 14 countries currently maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Most of them very small.
William, did you detect some maybe muddying of this in terms of the things that Liz Truss has said during the race?
Yes, I think it's quite an interesting issue, the one China policies. What Americans' one China policy is different from what Beijing's one China principle. I think the main difference is American or the Washington does not recognize Taiwan is part of China. I think that's quite an important part. Yeah. That's really make a difference. If you say Taiwan is part of the China or Taiwan is part of PRC, then it's a domestic issue. You don't have any internal of the the international laws. It's a right to get involved other countries' domestic issues. I think that's quite an important difference. The difference between the one China policy and Beijing's one China principle. Let's make a big difference.
It's a very nuanced issue. A lot of people who are not experts in this perhaps don't understand this. And of course, quite right, I mean, when China says one China, what they mean is you as a government have to recognize our position or have our claim that Taiwan is part of China. And of course, what the United States says, for example, is like, we take no position on Taiwan's sovereignty. What we recognize is China's position that Taiwan is part of them.
Yes, highly nuanced.
It is very, very nuanced, and it's often it's easy for people to misunderstand.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Let's move now quickly onto the economy. So China's ambassador has obviously threatened the UK with severe consequences if the trip goes ahead. China was the UK's largest import partner in 2021. 13.3% of all goods imported to the UK come from China. Could China use economic means to coerce or punish the UK for this trip?
China has a track record of doing this, according to countries that say that they have been on the receiving end of. Of course, the Chinese government denies this. But yeah, Lithuania is the most obvious example. It's not just Lithuania. Of course, Australia has complained about this as well, saying that their their exports from Australia to China have been impacted by this. And actually, one of the things when the Taiwan-US, the next round of trade talks happen, is this topic of economic coercion is going to be discussed. So what happens when we get a British parliamentary delegation here? Again, it's, you can't predict, but looking at the track record of what China's done, it's not unreasonable to suppose that perhaps there could be some kind of retaliation from China.
William, Liz Truss has emphasised national security over the economy. What would the UK need to do to decouple, and at what cost?
I think when Liz Truss said national security comes first before the economics, it's be honest, I really think it still need to wait and see. Maybe it's just a kind of in the context of atmosphere want to play tough with the China. I think after all, just look the US. Yeah, they even try. Yeah, they try to. I don't think the decouple is a kind of the good term. They just try to make a little bit safe, but there is no way to cut the connection between the Western countries and the China. Consider now the global, the globalization. It's very. I think it's just it will not happen.
I just want to ask a last question now. So Ben, firstly, moving to the Mandarin learning centres. Is there an opportunity for Taiwan to enhance its soft power globally?
So this is definitely something that Taiwan's government has been doing. Internationally there is a huge demand for learning Chinese, for learning Mandarin. And of course the Chinese government has seen that demand and they've established these Confucius centres, which in some cases have been very controversial. Of course China says that any suspicions you have about political influence, that's nonsense. Don't be so suspicious. But it's certainly attracted a lot of concern, especially in the United States. There are quite a lot of Confucius institutes in Britain, of course. Again, Taiwan is much smaller than China, right? We have a population of 23 million. China has a population of 1.3 billion, right? So sort of resource-wise, of course, China is always going to have more people to send to support this. But Taiwan has been quite good at promoting its soft power, bubble tea, for example. There's no equivalent internationally of K-pop for Taiwan, although we have very good music here, of course. And also Taiwan's international profile, of course, has been raised, but that's mostly, I think, recently because of all the tensions that we've had in the Taiwan Strait. Although I would say earlier on, when Taiwan was dealing very well with the COVID pandemic, that also very much raised Taiwan's international position. and made people realise, oh, this is Taiwan, this is what Taiwan is.
William, do you agree that it is a platform to raise Taiwan's soft power? Were you interested that Alicia Kearns MP said that she wanted the centres to basically allow Brits to learn more about Taiwan and about China?
Yes, I agree. I think that now, because the Chinese phenomenon, China is a big power, the European people, want to learn about Chinese. If you don't want to learn from China, of course, Taiwan's there, but there are options. And then I think Taiwan government need to, to catch up and to work hard on this.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to turn now to trade between Taiwan and the UK. And now we're joined by the CEO of the British Chamber of Commerce in Taipei, Richard Stokes-Green, to discuss trade between Taiwan and the UK. So Richard, you can see here that Taiwan was the UK's 28th trading partner, whereas the UK was Taiwan's 15th largest trading partner. This is in 2021. When we move to looking at the imports and exports, there is a balance there. And I understand that this has been caused by a jump in the imports from the UK into Taiwan. Is this remarkable?
Yes, I have to say that it's a pretty impressive growth year on year. I believe exports are up from the UK to Taiwan by something like 45% year on year. So the overall bilateral trades now stands to the end of Q1 2022 at something like £8.7 billion. I believe we have it in dollar terms here, around $10 billion US. So that is remarkable, as you say, that for the first time in quite some time we're seeing much more of a balance and equity between trade between Taiwan and the UK. I think the bulk of that growth has come from the service side.
Is that financial services?
A combination. I think we'll get to talking about it a little bit later because we can't avoid talking about it, but the offshore wind industry here is burgeoning. We've seen huge growth in that industry, and that needs to be supported by strong financial foundations. And traditionally, the UK has been a huge exporter of financial services to Taiwan, and I strongly suspect that much of that growth has come from green finance deals that are coming in to support this burgeoning offshore wind industry in Taiwan.
Ben, so from the Taiwan government's point of view, is this welcome to have that balance and not to have a trade deficit?
So certainly for the Taiwanese government, when they look at trade, so Taiwan is obviously a huge exporter, right? It's a major part of Taiwan's economy. The broader issue here, of course, is that the trade imbalance that Taiwan has traditionally run, especially with the United States, it affects things like it upsets the Americans because it leads to accusations of currency manipulation, of course, and of course Taiwan is I think it's now on the watch list for the US Treasury. For any country, basically, to have balanced trade is good. Now, of course, Taiwan, by dint of the fact that it is such a huge semiconductor producer, inevitably is going to run a large trade deficit with the rest, a large trade surplus with the rest of the world.
Richard, you mentioned the offshore wind market, and for the UK, Taiwan is the largest in the Asia Pacific. Can you tell us how that's developed? Why Taiwan?
Well, that again is nothing short of remarkable, really. The Taiwanese offshore wind market has basically gone from zero to being one of the world's most attractive offshore wind markets in the space of just about 5 years. When you set that against the context of COVID-19, it's incredible just to see the growth that has occurred over that period of time. So there's an enormous pipeline of projects in the planning and many under construction already. Several of which are being supported by funding. We just talked about the financial services side of things. The UK Export Finance is providing something like £500 million of credit guarantees to several of the projects that are already underway. So there's enormous growth there. To give one example, the Greater Changhua 1 project, which has received credit guarantees of around £200 million from UK Export Finance, that's set to have an installed capacity of around 605 megawatts, which equates to about 650,000 homes. Oh. And when you consider that there's a massive pipeline of projects under development with the goal of achieving the target of something like 20.5 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2035, you can see that offshore wind is going to become a really important contributor to Taiwan's domestic energy supply.
And renewables are extremely important for the Taiwanese government as it looks to shift away from certainly nuclear power and, of course, coal-powered fire stations. So this is absolutely a very big investment area, not just for British companies. I mean, other European companies as well are investing in it. Of course, Taiwan is an island. We sit on the Taiwan Strait. We have a lot of wind here.
Very true. Richard, so Taiwan recently signed up to reach the net zero goal by 2050. So along with wind, are there other ways that the UK and Taiwan are partnering?
Well, I think, as Ben just mentioned, renewables in general, not just offshore wind, have an important role to play. And one of the ways in which we're partnering with Taiwan is keeping the channels of communication open with regard to technology. The technology is advancing all the time. We've seen massive increases in efficiency and cost savings that have come from the technological advances that have occurred in offshore wind. But the same is happening across solar PV, across hydrogen. And so the UK and Taiwan have engaged in energy dialogue for the past 4 years. In fact, we just recently held the fourth UK-Taiwan energy dialogue. And one of the great outcomes of that was seeing that there's an agreement being reached on how to look at port infrastructure. The UK has been a world leader in offshore wind for something like 20 years now. It was a pioneer in the wind industry.
How much of the energy for the UK is from wind?
Well, right now we have the second largest installed capacity globally, something like 11.3 gigawatts of installed capacity. So it's massively important. And the same applies here in Taiwan. As I said at the start, Taiwan has an incredibly ambitious and progressive target of achieving 20.5 gigawatts. What's great about the development that's occurred in the Taiwanese industry so far is that it's been done in partnership, not just with UK businesses, but with businesses from all over Europe and around the world. So there's a recognition that this is a challenge that needs to be overcome in partnership with other countries.
Ben, you said that you've been talking to Taiwan policymakers about some of the green energy. Can you talk more about some of their goals in this area?
So President Tsai, and her administration have been very keen on the green energy issue. So there was a huge controversy, and so after remember the Fukushima nuclear disaster, right? There was a lot of concern in Taiwan at the time about, well, what is this? We're also on a major earthquake fault line. We have nuclear power stations. What happens to us if we get hit by something like this? So the government's plan is to phase out nuclear.
And also now Ukraine, of course.
Well, exactly. So the government already has an existing plan to phase out nuclear power. There have been complaints as well about air pollution in Taiwan from coal-powered, so they want to phase that out. And of course, you remember last year we had the referendum on the LNG, new LNG plant in Taoyuan. And of course, Taiwan also sees LNG as part of its greener future. But look, absolutely, the Taiwan government is extremely keen on developing green energy. And of course, as Richard was saying, it's not just about wind power, of course, it's solar as well. Taiwan is extremely keen on this and sort of putting solar panels in farms as well. So you have sort of a more sort of mixing sort of that land use. So you have your solar panels and you're growing, for example, vanilla pods or whatever it happens to be.
But has that take-up been slower, solar energy?
So look. I mean, the policy support is absolutely there. This is come right from the top. Taiwan may not be a member of the United Nations or have signed up to global climate treaties, but of course Taiwan wants to show that it is doing its part. It is a responsible member of the international community, and when it comes to tackling climate change, the government views this net zero pledge that they have as a very important, or the key role that it's going to play here.
Ben, could I also ask you regarding the UK's bid for the CPTPP? I understand that the UK has progressed to the next stage. This, of course, is the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Taiwan, of course, also is seeking membership. What is your reading of Taiwan's chances of joining?
Right. So obviously, like China applied to join, and then about a week later, Taiwan applied to join. Now, of course, the Chinese government says they oppose it, right? As in the same way the Chinese government opposes Taiwan's participation in any of these kind of international groups. Now, of course, Taiwanese policymakers say, well, actually, we're the qualified ones. It's China that's not qualified to join it, so we should be allowed in first. China should not be. So it's already become very, very political, right?
And the reasons for that Taiwan qualifies more?
Well, for example, like the Minister of Economic Affairs will say, like, we have the legislative systems in place when it comes to things like labour rights or environmental protection or IPR, all of that stuff. And they say, we're doing all this stuff. We're showing that we're willing to make the legislative changes that would be needed to guarantee our entry into the CPTPP, and China doesn't. Now, of course, China says, well, Taiwan is just part of us, like they have no right to join. Now, whether or not what happens in the end is what happened with the World Trade Organization, where both Taiwan and China join at the same time, is something that has been mooted. And then, of course, the name that Taiwan uses, is used to apply, of course, is the same name that it's used to the World Trade Organization, which is the separate customs territory. It's a bit of a mouthful. The separate customs territory of Taiwan, Penghu, Jinmen, and Mazu, I believe it is, to try and avoid the political problems. So obviously with Britain leaving the European Union, what the British government has been trying to do is go around the world and sign free trade agreements. Now, Britain and Taiwan do not have a free trade agreement. When I've talked to policymakers about this previously, what they've said to me is like, look, Britain knows our interest. If Britain wants to talk to us about it, we're very happy. Yeah, we'd love to sign a free trade agreement with them. Now, more recently, of course, because both Britain and Taiwan have applied to join the CPTPP, so for example, if Britain joins first and then Taiwan joins, then ultimately you're going to have both Britain and Taiwan within the same overarching free trade agreement, right? So the necessity to then sign or potentially sign a direct free trade agreement between Taiwan and Britain perhaps doesn't exist anymore, because all those sort of tariffs that you would have removed, for example, would presumably already be removed because you're all within the CPTPP group.
I understand that still Taiwan government is pursuing a bilateral trade investment agreement with the UK, and Alicia Kearns has said that she would like to see a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan.
So Taiwan is very keen to sign these bilateral trade agreements. Of course, the big one that they want is with the United States. I mean, they say it repeatedly, like John Dung, the chief trade representative, said it quite recently again. President Tsai has said it. What Taiwan wants with the European Union is something called a bilateral investment agreement, which has sort of been stalled for the last couple of years. But, Taiwanese officials have been quite open in saying, if Britain is happy to talk about this with them, we are 100% happy to talk about Britain with it and strive to achieve something like this.
Mm-hmm. Richard, if we can move to education services, which I understand is an important component of the trade relationship between the UK and Taiwan, how important is the Taiwanese market to the UK?
Well, it's incredibly important. But I would say not just the Taiwanese market, but the education market in general globally is extremely important. A lot of the challenges that we face today are transnational. They don't respect borders or boundaries, and we need collaborative approaches to address these challenges. One of the best ways that we can do that is through education. So the UK has been talking with government and academic institutions here in Taiwan about how we can help Taiwan achieve its bilingual 2030 ambitions. Again, another progressive and ambitious policy that Taiwan has put in place. And obviously the UK, dare I say, the home of the English language, obviously very well placed to support Taiwan in those ambitions. The UK also has a wealth of research on best teaching practices to optimize learning outcomes. And over the past couple of years, my peers at the British Council have been working closely with government here and academic institutions to look at how we can integrate those best practices into English language teaching here in Taiwan, so that ultimately Taiwan becomes somewhat self-sufficient in its English language instruction.
Well, I think we have to end it there. Thank you to my guests,